a blast. Then silence, not the silence of a moment, the kind that lasts 15 years. It took his father. It took his hearing, all in one day. People look at the scar running down his cheek and invent all kinds of underworld stories. But no one knows the truth that he hasn't heard a single sound in 15 years. And he guards that secret like his life depends on it. Because in his world, a weakness that shows is where the knife goes in. Now 3 faces are pressed to the crack in the door, grinning, waiting. They've pushed the poorest waitress in the building into a room with the most feared man in the city. As a joke. To watch her run out crying. That's the whole plan. But there's one thing they don't know. One thing about to blow the whole night apart. The girl sets down her tray. And she raises her hands. Chicago in November. Cold enough to see your breath. Wet enough to soak through cheap shoes. Ren Holloway had both. She was 27, and she was carrying a tray through the private dining room of a restaurant that cost more per plate than she made in a night. Her hands were rough. 2 shifts back to back will do that. Her hair was pinned up in a hurry, and her eyes were the kind that always looked down. Not from fear. People thought it was fear. It wasn't. It was because she was the one who watched, not the one who got watched. There's a difference. She'd learned it young. 4 years she'd worked that floor. 4 years. And in 4 years she'd poured coffee on time, wiped down her tables, folded napkins into shapes nobody noticed, and told exactly no one a single true thing about her life. So they called her names, the stuck-up girl, the snob in the worn-out shoes. That one. And not one of them ever asked why. Not one of them ever wondered where she went on Wednesday nights after close. When the others peeled off to the bar down the street, and she slipped out the back into the dark, they figured she thought she was better than them. That was easier than asking. The truth was smaller. And bigger. Every Wednesday, Ren took 2 buses across the city to a community center at the end of a quiet street, to a room with plastic chairs and a whiteboard nobody had cleaned right in years. To learn sign language, because her brother couldn't hear. But nobody at the restaurant knew that. Nobody knew she had a brother at all. That was the wall. And Ren had built it, brick by brick, year by year. Until she could stand in a crowded kitchen and feel like the only person in an empty field. She had a reason. Everybody who builds a wall like that has a reason. Hers was named Silas. And it went back a long, long way. But we'll get to him. Let me tell you what 4 years in that place does to a person. It teaches you the geography of a kitchen, which floorboard creaks, which corner the cameras don't reach, which manager to avoid on a Friday. You learn the restaurant the way a soldier learns a field. Not because you love it, because you have to. Ren knew all of it. She knew that the head chef softened up after the first rush. She knew that the busboys were kinder than they let on. She knew that if you smiled at the right customer, you might make rent that week. And if you smiled at the wrong one, you might spend the walk home wishing you hadn't. She knew all the small rules, the ones nobody writes down. But there was one rule she'd never broken. Never let them see inside. Because the moment they see inside, they own a piece of you. And Ren had learned the hard way, years ago, that people do terrible things with the pieces of you they own. So she gave them nothing. No stories, no family, no past. Just a girl in worn-out shoes, carrying a tray, head down, and they hated her for it. Isn't that the strange thing about people? You'd think a quiet, harmless woman who bothered no one would be left alone. But no. A person who won't open up becomes a puzzle. And a puzzle becomes an insult. And an insult becomes a target. They called her cold because she was careful. They called her a snob because she was tired. Right now, on this particular Thursday. Something was about to happen. And it started with a man named Dorsey. Dorsey was the shift manager. He had a clipboard he didn't need and a smile that never reached his eyes. He liked to be liked. And he really hated anyone who didn't seem to care whether he liked them or not. Ren didn't care. That was her crime. So when Dorsey gathered the crew by the service door that night and leaned in and started whispering, Ren felt it before she understood it. That prickle on the back of the neck. The way a room shifts when you become the subject and not the audience. They were looking at her, all of them. Dorsey. Bronwyn, with her sharp mouth and her sharper eyes. Corbin, the young one, hanging at the edge like he wasn't sure he belonged there. And a couple of others whose faces would blur in her memory later, the way background faces do. Looking at her. And grinning. Ren straightened her apron. Kept her face flat, because when you've been the target before, you learn to give them nothing. You go still. You go quiet. You wait to see what shape the cruelty takes this time. Dorza walked over. Slow. Enjoying it. Got a special assignment for you, Holloway? She waited. Table 12. Private room. Our best guest. He let that hang. You know the one, she did. Everyone did. Ambrose Calloway. They said a lot of things about Ambrose Calloway. They said he ran the West Side. The parts of it you don't read about. They said he came in every Thursday, alone to the room at the end of the hall, ordered without speaking, tipped like a king, and answered no one. Not the servers, not the manager, not the owner himself. They said he was arrogant, cold, that he faked being deaf just to seem important, just to make people lean in and strain and feel small. That was the story. That was the joke, and that was the trap, because here's what Dorsey and his little crew had cooked up. Push the poorest waitress they had into the room with the scariest man in the building. Give her to a guest who wouldn't say a word back. Watch her stand there. Watch her fumble. Watch her flush red and run out crying while they crouched behind the service door and laughed. That was the whole plan. Humiliate the quiet girl, and they were so proud of it. What none of them knew, what none of them could have known was the one thing that would blow the whole night apart. Ambrose Calloway wasn't faking. He hadn't heard a sound in 15 years. Not since the blast, the one that took his father. And took his hearing along with it. 15 years of a silent world. 15 years of reading lips off every face in every room. So fast, so smooth, that people just thought he was cold. He guarded that secret like his life depended on it. Because in his world, it did. A weakness that shows is a weakness someone uses. A crack that shows is where the knife goes in. So he let them believe the arrogant story. He let them think he was pretending. Because a lie about pride was harmless. And the truth about a wound could get a man killed. So there it was. The poorest waitress in the building. And the loneliest man in the city. Pushed into a room together. As a joke, neither of them knowing what the other was. They thought they knew Ren Holloway. They didn't know her at all. Ren picked up the tray, and she walked toward the room at the end of the hall. She could feel them behind her. Feel the eyes. Feel the held breath of people waiting for a show. Her stomach was tight. Her palms were damp against the metal. She told herself it was just a table, just a guest, just another face that would look through her like she was furniture. She'd survived that 1,000 times. She'd survive it once more. She reached the door. She pushed it open, and there he was. Ambrose Calloway sat at the head of the table, tall, even sitting down, broad through the shoulders. Dark hair combed back, with a few early streaks of silver at the temples. A faint scar ran down his left cheekbone, and his eyes. His eyes were so still they looked cold. Ren set the tray down. Softly. She'd learned to be soft. "Good evening," she said. "I'll be your server tonight." Nothing. He didn't look up. Didn't nod. Didn't blink. She swallowed. Tried again. Read the specials off the little card in her hand. Kept her voice level, warm, professional. Still nothing. And behind the service door she couldn't see them, but she could feel them, 3 faces pressed close to the crack. Grinning, waiting. This was the part they'd paid for. The long, awful silence. The moment the quiet girl realized she was alone in a room with a wall. Any second now, she'd break. Any second now, she'd run. That was the plan, except Ren didn't break. Because in that silence, that long, cold, deliberate silence, something clicked in her. Some old, familiar recognition. She'd stood in a silence like this before. In a small apartment, across a kitchen table. Looking at a boy who couldn't hear her voice, no matter how loud she made it. She knew this silence. She lived in it every night. And so, instead of falling apart the way the whole crew was praying she would, Ren did the last thing anyone in that building expected. She looked him dead in the eye. She raised her rough, calloused hands, and she began to sign, slow, clear. Steady, hello. I'm your server tonight. What would you like? The room changed. You could almost hear it. That's the strange part. The whole room changed. And it didn't make a sound. Ambrose Calloway's head came up. For the first time in 15 years, a stranger was speaking to him in his own language. Not louder, not slower, not with that awful pity people ladle on when they figure it out. Not looking away from him and talking to the empty chair beside him like he wasn't even there. She was just talking to him, and that ice-cold stare, the one the whole city whispered about, cracked. Right down the middle. His eyes moved, following her hands, reading the shapes. And Ren saw it happen, saw the exact moment. The coldness fell away, and something underneath it came up to the surface. Something that had been buried a long, long time. Surprise. And under the surprise, something that looked almost like being found.
Behind the service door, 3 grinning faces went slack because they couldn't read the hands. They didn't know what those moving fingers meant.
All they knew was that their show had gone wrong. The girl wasn't crying. The girl wasn't running. The girl was standing there, calm, talking, and the terrifying, silent, untouchable boss was leaning in, watching her like she was the only thing in the room. Their little joke had slipped out of their hands, and it was never coming back. Ambrose raised one hand, careful, almost like he didn't trust it, and he signed back. Just one word, coffee. Ren nodded, wrote it down like it was nothing. Like her heart wasn't slamming against her ribs, like the floor hadn't just tilted under her feet. Anything else? A pause. His hand hovered no. She nodded again, picked up the tray, and walked out of the room on legs that didn't quite feel like her own. The crew scattered from the door as she came through. Suddenly very busy. Suddenly very interested in the floor, the trays, the coffee machine. Nobody looked at her. Nobody said a word. Dorsey's jaw was tight. Bronwyn's mouth had gone thin, and Corbin the young one just stared at her, then looked away fast, like he'd seen something he wasn't supposed to. Ren didn't understand it yet. She didn't know about the plan. She didn't know about the crack in the door, or the held breath, or the show that had just fallen apart in their hands. All she knew was that something strange had just happened in that room, and she carried it with her the rest of the night, through every table, every check, every trip past that quiet door at the end of the hall. She carried it like a warm coal cupped in both palms. She'd talked to him, and he'd talked back. That was all, and it was everything. The shift ended the way every shift ended. Ren took off her apron near midnight, clocked out, pulled her thin coat tight, and stepped into the drizzle. The bus came late. It always came late. She sat by the fogged glass and watched Chicago slide past. Yellow lamplight smearing across the window. The city going by like something underwater. All the way south, all the way home. Home was the 3rd floor of an old building on the south side. Stairs that always smelled damp. A hallway light that flickered. Because the landlord had promised to fix it 2 winters ago and never did. She unlocked the door quietly. Because she knew Silas was asleep. Her brother was 22. Broad-shouldered now, though she still saw the 7-year-old sometimes. When the light hit him right, he'd left the desk lamp on for her. And there, beside the rice pot on the counter, a note. Just a few crooked words. Saved you some. Eat it. Ren stood in the cramped little kitchen and looked at that scrap of paper for a long time. Because after a whole day of faces that looked at her like she was a piece of used furniture, That scrap of paper was the only thing in the world, reminding her that she was a person, that she mattered to someone, that someone had waited. The apartment was small. 2 rooms and a kitchen you could cross in 3 steps. But Ren had made it a home, the way poor people make homes, with effort and stubbornness and love that shows up as small things. A lamp left on, a meal set aside, a note on the counter. There was a photograph on the shelf, the only one she'd kept. Their mother young, holding a baby that was Silas, with a girl at her side that was Ren, 4 years old, gap-toothed, grinning. Nobody in that picture knew what was coming. That was the mercy of photographs. They freeze you before the hard part. Ren looked at it sometimes. Not often, because looking too long hurt. But sometimes on the bad nights, she'd stand in front of that shelf, and she'd look at the woman who'd held them both, and she'd whisper out loud, where no one could hear, that she was doing her best. She was doing her best. That was all she had. Some nights, it didn't feel like enough. You want to know the truth about people who carry too much? They don't do it for themselves. Nobody carries that weight for themselves. They'd have put it down years ago. They carry it for someone. Ren carried it for Silas. Now. This is his sister's story, but it started with him. So, let me tell you about the night. Everything went quiet. Silas was 7. When the fever came, Ren remembered it better than she wanted to. She was 12. Their mother was already in the hospital by then. Their father was somewhere. He was often somewhere in those days, and Silas got hot. So hot that his skin frightened her. She didn't have money for a doctor. She didn't have a mother to call. She had a cold cloth, and a bowl of water, and a little brother, burning up, in a bed too big for him, and she sat with him all night, changing the cloth, talking to him, so he wouldn't be scared, talking, and somewhere in the middle of that long night, the fever broke, and the talking stopped working, because when Silas woke up in the gray light of morning and Ren said his name, he didn't turn. She said it again. Louder, he didn't turn, and she understood. The way you understand a thing you'll spend the rest of your life trying to ununderstand. The fever had taken something that wasn't coming back. Their mother died a few months later, in that same hospital, sending home bills that would follow Ren for years, like a shadow she'd learned to carry. And their father went looking for answers at the bottom of a bottle. And one day he went looking, and he just didn't come back. So it was Ren and Silas, 12 and 7. 2 kids in a quiet house. And here's the thing nobody tells you about a house going quiet. It doesn't stay the same size. The silence grows, if you let it, a little every year, until the person you love most is standing right there, and you can't reach them anymore. Ren watched that start to happen. She'd sign the little she knew from a library book, and Silas would look at her hands, frustrated, not understanding, and she'd get it wrong, and he'd turn away and go quieter, retreating into a world she couldn't follow him into. And it terrified her, more than the poverty, more than the empty cupboard, more than the long nights alone, at 12, being somehow a mother. The thing that terrified her was losing him to the silence, so she learned. God, how she learned. She stole time wherever she could find it. She learned from books that fell apart in her hands. She learned in front of a cracked mirror, making the shapes wrong, until one night, she sat across from Silas at the little table, and she signed a whole sentence, slow and clear. Did you eat enough? And Silas looked at her hands, and his face changed because he understood. For the first time in months, his sister had reached him, all the way, across the silence, and he laughed. That laugh, unlike any other sound in the world. The sound of a door opening between 2 people who'd been afraid they might be locked apart forever. From that night on, Ren understood something most people never learn, that the deepest things you ever say to another person, sometimes those don't need a single sound at all. That was hers. That was the treasure she kept in the worn coat pocket of her life. the part of her nobody at the restaurant knew existed. She sat at the little table that Thursday night, and she ate the cold rice her brother had saved for her. And for the first time in a long time, her mind wasn't empty, because all the way home, she'd been thinking about a pair of eyes. Eyes the whole restaurant swore were cold as ice. But she'd seen something else in them. When she raised her hands, when she spoke to him in her own language, for a few minutes tonight, a stranger had looked at her, not like an object, not like furniture, like a human being. And that, though she didn't dare name it yet, had slipped like a thin beam of light into the wall she'd spent so long building. She washed the one bowl, turned off the light, stood at the window and looked down at the wet street, blurred yellow. Tomorrow she'd go to work on time, wipe the tables clean, keep herself closed off, like always. That was the plan, but even as she thought it, she felt something shift, quiet, small, like a door opening just a crack. Before anyone had decided whether it should open all the way, Wednesday came. The only night that was hers, the community center. The plastic chairs in a circle, the whiteboard with its ghost of old ink. To most people, it would have looked like nothing. To Ren, it was almost the only place she could breathe. The teacher was a deaf woman named Maisie. And Maisie didn't teach sign language like a list of moves to memorize. She taught it like a language with breath in it, with mood, with the face and the pause and the silence all doing their part. She used to sign something Ren never forgot. The hands tell what the throat keeps hidden. Ren believed that, because it was truer of her than she'd ever admit out loud. That Wednesday, there was a new student, an old man, maybe 70, big hands, folded in his lap, not sure what to do with them. He'd come, he told the class, because his wife was losing her hearing. To age, the way some things go, slowly, and then all at once, and Maisie signed to him. Slow, that the hands he'd used his whole life, for work, for carrying, for holding, were about to learn a new job, to talk. Ren watched that old man, and she saw something she recognized, the fear of a person who loves someone. On the other side of a silence, because she'd been there, at 12 years old, in the doorway of a room where her little brother sat, realizing that if she didn't find another way to reach him, the distance would just keep growing. Year after year, she'd never forgotten that fear. So after class, she stayed, and she signed to the old man. Slow. Careful. The way Maisie had once signed to her, she told him that the first sentence his wife understood from his hands would be the best sound he'd never hear. The old man's eyes went red, and he nodded. And he practiced, that night, the same 3 signs, over and over, until his big, clumsy hands got them right. And Ren went home thinking that this was the thing nobody at the restaurant would ever understand about her. That the quiet girl in the worn-out shoes spent her Wednesday nights teaching an old man how to say I love you to his wife. Without a sound, that was who she was, behind the wall. And nobody knew. That same night, Maisie asked the class a question. She signed it slow, so everyone caught it. What makes you stay with this hard language? One by one, people answered. And then it was Ren's turn. She lifted her hands, and slowly, she told them. She signed that she learned it so that every night, when she came home tired, she could still ask her brother how his day had been, and get a real answer. Not a nod, a whole answer. She signed that she learned it, so her brother would never sit alone inside his own silence and feel like the world had left without him. When she lowered her hands, the room was still. Maisie looked at her a long moment. Then she signed. You're not just learning this language. You're keeping a promise. And Ren felt her throat go tight. Because that was the thing she'd never named. The thing she'd carried all these years without a word for it. A promise. On the way home that night, she thought about last Thursday. About the man in the private room. About the moment her hands went up and the ice in his eyes cracked open. It was the first time. The very first time that the language she'd kept only for Silas had reached out and touched a stranger. And strangely, that didn't feel like losing something. It felt like something had been connected. Like the most private part of her, the part she'd saved. For one person, had found another place in the world where it was allowed to exist. When she got home, Silas was still up, sitting at the table, bent over technical drawings for his trade class. He looked up when she came in, signed, "How was class?" She sat down across from him, and instead of telling him about class, she told him about a guest at the restaurant, who had, out of nowhere, understood the language the two of them shared. Silas raised his eyebrows. Then he laughed and teased her with his hands. Signed something like, "Finally, someone else in the whole world who can talk to you the way I do." Ren laughed with him, a rare light laugh. And in that warm little moment, in that cramped apartment with the rain on the window and her brother grinning across the table, she had no way of knowing that the Thursday night that seemed so accidental hadn't been an accident at all, that it had been a trap, set on purpose, and that the people at the restaurant had watched her walk into that room with an intention she hadn't discovered yet. But she'd discover it soon. The Thursdays kept coming, and something in that private room started to change. The first night, she'd frozen. The second night, less. Third, the shock of it had softened into something almost like ease. He no longer looked at her like a server. She no longer looked at him like a stranger the whole city feared. He'd set his glass down slow, and they'd talk. With their hands. Every move he made was firm and exact, like a man who'd lived with silence so long he'd turned it into his own flesh and blood. And Ren, who used to stand there with her heart in her throat, found herself signing freely. About small things. Then carefully, about bigger ones. One night she meant Silas. Just a little. That she'd learned to sign for a brother who lived in a world with less sound than most. He nodded. No pity. None of that hollow, breathy sympathy people pour out when they hear a thing like that. He just nodded. Like she'd told him the time. And once, early on, he'd signed something that stopped her cold. You came here to serve, not to be sent in as a pawn. She hadn't understood it. Not fully. Not then. But it told her one thing. The man across the table was far, far fresher than the cold story the whole restaurant told about him. Another night, she signed the specials and made a small joke that the soup had probably gone cold, sitting too long on the counter under Dorsey's careless watch. Ambrose lifted one eyebrow and signed back, "I can't hear this whole city anyway, so if a bowl of cold soup wants to complain, I won't hear that either, we're even." And Ren laughed, out loud. Before she could catch it, a real laugh. The first real laugh she'd let fall in that building in months. Because she had not expected the man everyone feared to have a dry, sly humor tucked behind that stone-still face. That laugh was like a pebble dropped on still water. He saw her smile, and something in his eyes went soft. Like the coldness everyone talked about was only the outer shell of a man who'd gone too long with no one bothering to really speak to him. There was a Thursday, somewhere in the middle of all those Thursdays, that Ren would come back to later. Turn over in her mind. The way you do with a moment you didn't know was important until much later. It was nothing, really. He'd been quiet that night, quieter than usual. She'd set down his coffee and started to leave, and he'd stopped her. With a small motion of his hand, he signed, "Do you ever get tired?" And she'd stood there, not sure how to answer, because nobody had asked her that. Not in years. People asked if she could cover a shift, if she could stay late, if she could take table 9. Nobody asked if she was tired, so she told him the truth. "Every day," she signed. "I get tired every day," and he'd nodded. Like he understood exactly. Not the polite nod people give. The real one. The one that says, "Me too." Then he'd signed something she didn't expect. "Tired people," he said, "are the strongest people I know. Because they keep going anyway. Anyone can carry a weight when they're fresh. It takes something else to carry it when you've got nothing left." And then he'd gone back to his coffee. like he hadn't just said the kindest thing anyone had said to her in a decade. Ren carried that home because he was paying attention. That was the whole secret. It wasn't magic, it wasn't fate. He was just paying attention. In a world where nobody paid attention to anybody anymore, where everybody was too busy, too tired, too wrapped up in themselves to look up and really see the person in front of them. He looked up. He saw her, and a woman who has spent her whole life being looked through. Will never forget the first person who looks at her. Never. The service that was supposed to take 5 minutes started stretching. Longer. Longer. He asked about her brother, about his trade school. She told him a few careful things, just enough. Two strangers in a private room, who'd found in each other a language wider than their hands. The understanding of two people used to being looked at, and never once truly seen. Meanwhile, on the other side of the door, in the narrow crack that opened toward the service hall, the three faces that had come for a one-night humiliation were getting more frustrated by the week. They'd stood there with their half-smiles, waiting for the poor girl to stumble, and week after week, all they got was two pairs of hands answering each other in a smooth, easy rhythm. The laughter of someone they'd been so sure would cry, and the eyes of a boss everyone swore was made of ice-fixed, careful, warm, on the very server they'd shoved in as a joke. One of them nudged another. Nobody said anything, and one by one, they slipped away from the crack, carrying the deepening sourness of people who'd staged a show, and watched its ending slip out of their hands for good. Inside, Ren had no idea. That happiness lasted right up until the moment she carried the last stack of trays down into the dish area behind the kitchen, where, hidden behind the rows of steel racks, under the hiss of running water, Dorsey and Bronwyn were standing and laughing. They didn't know she'd come close, so they weren't guarding a thing. Bronwyn was wiping her hands, giggling. I honestly thought she'd just stand there like a statue, then run out bawling. Who could have guessed? And Dorsey, that bitter, frustrated laugh of his. The whole thing's ruined. Weeks. Weeks we've been standing outside that door, waiting to watch her make a fool of herself with the stone-deaf boss. And we got nothing. Stone-deaf boss. The words hit Ren like cold water down the spine. She stopped, behind the rack, the trays still in her hands, and the whole thing fell into place. The smirks, the sudden, special assignment. The way they'd all looked at her by the service door with those grins, the held breath. She hadn't been given a hard shift by chance. She'd been served up. She and that man both. Served up as a cheap little spectacle. For their entertainment, Ren stood frozen, and she felt the warm thing she'd carried out of that room start to harden in her chest. Then turn, then sour, thick and bitter, like something beautiful left out too long in the open air, spoiling before anyone could save it. But here's the strange part. What hurt most wasn't that they'd made a joke of her. She was used to that. A joke aimed at her she could take. She'd taken worse. What chilled her, what lit a slow, low anger deep in her gut, was the other thing. They'd dragged him into it. They'd dragged that man into their joke without thinking of him as a human being for even 1 second. They'd called him the stone-deaf boss with a laugh in their voices. Like the fact that he couldn't hear was a flaw. A punchline. A toy. They'd taken the one part of him he kept most hidden, and they'd used it for a cheap little show. And Ren thought of Silas as. She thought of how she'd fought her whole life, so that no one would ever turn her brother into a joke just because he lived in a world with fewer sounds. And it hit her, cold and clear. If she hadn't stepped up, if she hadn't raised her hands that first night, then an innocent man would have been left sitting in that room, in the dark of a silence he couldn't escape, the target of a cruelty he couldn't even hear coming. Her grip tightened on the trays. Knuckles white. She didn't step forward. She didn't say a word. She didn't let them know she'd heard, because she knew the anger in her, if she let it out right now, would just become a loud fight in a kitchen. A fight that would fade by morning. and change nothing. So she set the trays down, quiet, turned, and walked away. And on the whole long ride home that night, she thought about one question, coming back again and again, like water lapping at a shore. How many times in a life are people willing to turn another person's dignity into entertainment? Just because they believe that person will never find out. She carried that question all week, like a small sharp stone in her coat pocket. Not heavy enough to bring her down, but sharp enough that every time she touched it, it cut. She came to work on time, wiped the tables clean, kept herself closed off, and she'd almost convinced herself it was just one more thing to let pass, until the next Thursday, when the door opened, and he walked in again. That familiar calm stride, except this time. He didn't go straight down the hall to the room at the end. This time he stopped at the host's stand and looked directly at Dorsey, and with a short handwritten note pushed across the wood he requested, by name, the server from last Thursday night, to wait on him, privately. No one else. Ren stood a few steps away, and she saw Dorsey's face change. The mocking look vanished, replaced by the awkwardness of a man who just realized the joke he set up had turned around and started walking back toward him, in a direction he couldn't control. He glanced at her, then gave a stiff little nod. So Ren picked up the tray and carried it down the hall, into that private room. But this time, everything was different. This time, she wasn't the girl shoved in to be a joke. This time, she was the one he'd chosen. The door clicked shut behind her, and for a moment, neither of them moved. He lifted one hand and signed for her to sit. She hesitated, because that went against every rule of the job. Servers don't sit. Servers stand. Servers stay near the door and wait to be needed and disappear when they're not. But something in his eyes made her set the tray down and sit on the very edge of the chair, like she might have to bolt at any second. He watched her do it, and the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but close. Then he began to sign slow, careful, like a man opening a drawer he hadn't opened in years. Do you know why this whole city says I only pretend to be deaf? She didn't answer. She didn't have to. He wasn't really asking to seem important. That's what they say, that I fake it to make people lean in and feel small, and I let them believe it, because a rumor about arrogance is harmless. But the truth, his hands paused, the truth about a weakness, that can make a man pay dearly. Ren went very still, because she understood, in that moment, that he was about to hand her something heavy, something he'd never handed to anyone. He lifted his hand to the faint scar running down his cheekbone, touched it, almost gently. I haven't heard a single sound in 15 years. The room seemed to hold its breath. There was an explosion. He signed. It took my ear, and it took my hearing. With it, it took my father. All in one day. He said it calm, like he was talking about a distant winter. No self-pity, no drama, just a truth he'd learned to live beside. He was 18, he signed. That's how old he'd been. Younger than most people pictured when they heard the stories. His father had been a man of that world, and Ambrose had been raised into it, the way some sons are raised into a family business. Except the business had teeth. People look at this scar, he went on, and they invent all kinds of stories. Underworld stories, dramatic ones. But to me, it's only what's left of the day I lost everything at once and had to grow up overnight. Ren watched every movement of his hands, barely breathing. After that, he signed. I learned to read lips. Every face in every room. I learned to watch so carefully that nobody ever noticed I was making up for what I'd lost. I hid it so well that only a few people alive know the truth. His hands slowed, because in my world, a man who can't hear is a man who can't survive. You can't hear the footstep behind you. You can't hear the word whispered across a room. You can't hear the warning. Showing a weakness is the same as signing your own death warrant. And then he stopped. And he just looked at her, and Ren understood with a clarity that made her chest ache that the man across the table had just given her something more valuable than trust. He'd placed in her hands the exact part of himself he'd spent his entire life protecting. She lifted her own hands. Slow. Why? Why tell all this to a server you've met once? He looked at her a long moment. Because you were the first person in years to walk into this room and speak to me like I'm an ordinary man. Not a boss to fear, not a cripple to pity. You didn't talk louder. You didn't talk slower. You didn't look away. You just talked. To me, his hands went still for a beat. And that's so rare, he signed, that I'd almost forgotten what it felt like. And there it was, the smile. Small, fleeting. The first real one Ren had ever seen on that cold face. But enough. Enough for her to feel the wall between them slide back another inch. And in that moment, she realized something about her own anger. The anger she'd carried all week like a stone in her pocket. It hadn't softened. It had just changed shape into a quiet, fierce wish that this man, whoever he was out there in the dark of the city, deserved to be treated with more kindness than the people hiding behind that door had ever shown him. She left the room that night, carrying something new, and she wasn't sure yet what to call it, but it had weight, and it had warmth, and it wasn't going away. Now, here's where things get complicated, because a secret is a heavy thing to carry, but so is a favor, and Ren was about to learn that the most powerful guest in the restaurant, asking for one specific server, by name, every single week. That kind of thing doesn't stay quiet. Not in a place that runs on whispers. Within a few days, the way her coworkers looked at her had changed. It wasn't just the old dismissive look anymore, the one they gave the ragged little snob. Now, it was mixed with something else. Curiosity, suspicion, and in some of them, jealousy. They started to notice things. That every Thursday night, she got called into the room at the end of the hall. That she stayed in there far longer than any normal service needed. That when she came out, there was a strange, unexplainable calm on her face, and nobody could figure out why. The one it ate at most was Dorsey, because his cruel little scheme hadn't just failed. It had backfired. Spectacularly. He'd tried to break the quiet girl for a laugh. Instead, he'd handed her a crown. He'd watched the very woman he wanted to humiliate become the chosen confidante of the most feared, most powerful guest in the building. And him. The man who'd always assumed he had the right to arrange everyone and everything in that place. That same man had looked Dorsey dead in the face and given him nothing. Not one word, the feeling of being ignored, on his own turf. By a man he couldn't touch. It curdled in him, day by day. And so Dorsey did what small, prideful men always do when they can't stand to watch someone they look down on rise above them. He started planting seeds, at first just a few words. Tossed out casual, like accidents. During the busy rush when plenty of ears were around. Funny, isn't it? Some girl with nothing special about her, suddenly the boss's favorite. Who knows what those two are getting up to? In that little private room, all those hours, half joking, half serious, dropped at exactly the moments the most people could hear, vague enough that he could always laugh and say he was only having fun, but poison enough to plant a rotten little picture in every mind that caught it. And Bronwyn, who'd never liked Ren. Bronwyn jumped in fast, added color, added venom, until the story had been twisted a dozen times over. Passed mouth to mouth. Growing uglier each time. Here's the thing about rumors. They don't need to be true. They just need to be interesting. And the truth about Ren Holloway, a tired woman who happened to know sign language, sitting with a lonely man who happened to be deaf, wasn't interesting. It was just human. It was just two people talking. But Dorsey's version? A poor girl clawing her way up by cozying up to a dangerous man? That was interesting. That had spice. That gave people something to chew on with their after-shift beer. So Dorsey's version spread, and the truth just sat there. Quiet. Ignored the way the truth usually does. Ren felt it happen. She wasn't stupid. She'd feel a conversation stop when she walked into the break room. She'd catch the sideways looks, the little smirks. The way people who used to just ignore her now watched her. Like she was a show. And the worst part? She couldn't fight it. Because how do you fight a whisper? You can't stand up in the middle of a kitchen and announce the truth. That would just make it worse. The only thing you can do against a rumor is nothing. And nothing feels like drowning. So she drowned, quietly, the way she did everything. The quieter she stayed. The more she refused to explain herself. The more they took her silence as a confession. But in the middle of all that thickening poison, one person started to feel sick about it. Corbin, the youngest one. The one who'd stood behind the crack in the door that first Thursday night. Who'd laughed along with the rest. Corbin wasn't cruel. That was the thing. He was just young and weak, easily pulled along by the crowd, terrified of being the outsider, of being the one they turned on next. But as he watched the rumor drift further and further from what he'd thought was just harmless teasing, as he watched it start aiming, on purpose, at her dignity in a way that got harder and harder to listen to, something in him started to hurt. He remembered her calm face when she came out of that room. He remembered that in all these weeks, she'd done nothing. Nothing to deserve words like these. And he began to understand dimly that he'd helped build something ugly. Even if all he'd done was stand there and laugh, he still didn't have the courage to say anything. When Dorsey dropped another remark, Corbin stayed silent, lowered his face, avoided Ren's eyes when he passed her. But the sickness in him kept growing, like a seed planted in the wrong place, in the dark, and though he didn't know it yet, that slow, gnawing guilt would one day become the thing that made all the difference. For now. He said nothing, and the kitchen got more suffocating by the day. But the Thursday nights kept coming, and, no matter what waited for her outside that room. Inside it, Ren felt like she could breathe. Because in there, she wasn't the ragged little snob. She wasn't the subject of kitchen gossip. She was just a person, being listened to, and, if the last time had been Ambrose opening up, giving her the thing he hid deepest, then this time, for reasons she didn't fully understand, Ren found herself wanting to speak, maybe because she'd seen him hand her his truth. And it felt unfair to keep hiding forever behind her own wall. That night, he signed and asked her why. Why someone as young as she was had chosen to live so closed off. She was quiet a long while. Then she lifted her hands and began to tell him. She signed that she hadn't always been this way. That once there'd been someone she trusted. Someone she'd told everything to. Someone she'd leaned on during the hardest days of her life. And because she'd trusted them so completely, she hadn't been on guard. When they asked to borrow the money she'd saved, $1 at a time, for months, money she'd set aside for something important, something to do with her brother, then one day, that person vanished. With all of it, no explanation, no goodbye. Just an empty hand where the money used to be, and a lesson she never wanted to learn again. What hurt most wasn't the money. I could earn money again, extra shifts. What broke me was knowing I'd trusted the wrong person. That the softest part of me, the part I opened to someone, was the exact part they used to hurt me. She signed. So I built walls. Not because I'm cold, the way people think. Because I'm afraid. Afraid that if I open myself one more time, the next wound might be one I can't get up from. Ambrose watched her hands the whole time. He didn't interrupt. He didn't rush to comfort her. He didn't offer empty advice. He just looked at her, with eyes that said, I understand. And so she kept going. She told him about Silas, about her 22-year-old brother studying a trade, about the fever when he was 7 that took part of his hearing, that turned his world into a place with fewer sounds than everyone else's. She signed that Silas was the reason she'd found her way to sign language, that the money she'd been tricked out of all those years ago had been meant for him, and that no matter how much life took from her, she had always promised herself one thing. She would never let her brother feel abandoned, alone, inside his own silence. And when she spoke of Silas, Something changed in Ambrose's eyes. He sat a little straighter, leaned in, because this was the first time he'd heard about that brother. About the real reason a poor server could be fluent in the very language he'd been forced to live with his whole life. And he understood. Her speaking hands weren't a lucky accident. They were the result of years. Years of quiet love. He lifted his hands and signed a sentence would carry with her a long time afterward. Most people believe listening lives in the ears, but I know better than anyone. There are people who can hear every sound in the world and never once truly hear another person, and there are people who can't hear a single sound and listen more clearly than anyone alive. When he finished, they both went quiet, and it wasn't an awkward quiet. It was warm. Like inside that little room, two people who'd spent their lives hiding behind walls had just looked up and seen each other in a way almost no one ever had. Two wounds from two different lives. One person closed off because her trust had been betrayed. The other lonely in the middle of all his power. And somehow, when they reflected each other, they didn't deepen the pain, they eased it. Ren left that room feeling something she hadn't felt in a very long time. The feeling that maybe not every open door led to a new wound. That maybe there were still people in this world worth stepping past your own wall for. Worth trusting one more time. But the warmth didn't survive the walk back to the floor. Because out there, under Dorsey's hand, the whispers had stopped being whispers. He didn't just toss out casual remarks in the kitchen anymore. Now he pushed them into the staff group chat, where everyone could read them. And nobody dared to push back. He wrote messages, suggesting the only reason an ordinary girl like Ren had suddenly become the favorite of the most powerful man in the building was that she knew how to trade. That she was latching onto a rich, dangerous man from the underworld to claw her way up out of her poor server's life. He wrapped it all in the disguise of a joke. Little laughing symbols after each line, to make it look harmless, but everyone who read it understood. He was smearing her in the filthiest way he could, and it didn't stop at words. He started doing things that made Ren's skin crawl whenever he was near. He'd block her path in the narrow hallways behind the kitchen, so she'd have to squeeze past him. Close. He'd make comments about her in that mocking tone, and when she flinched, when she showed she didn't like it, he'd laugh and say she was being too tense, that he was only joking, that she needed to relax. That trick, turning the victim into the one overreacting. It left Ren angry and trapped all at once, because he was the shift manager. He held her schedule. He held her job in his hands, and she understood. If she made it a bigger thing, the first person to suffer for it would be her. And here's the part that made her stomach turn. She started to realize, through averted eyes, through half-finished sentences that stopped when she walked in, that she wasn't the only one. There'd been other girls before her who'd worked that floor and endured the same thing from Dorsey, and quietly quit without reporting anything, because everyone was afraid. Everyone needed the job, and everyone knew the truth. The word of a server carries almost no weight. Against a manager the higher-ups liked. Ren thought about those other girls a lot in those days. The ones who came before her. The ones who'd worked that floor and endured the same hands, the same comments, the same cornering in the same narrow halls, and who'd left. Quietly. Without a word. She'd never met them. They were gone before she arrived. But she felt them, like ghosts in that building. Like a warning written on the walls in ink only she could read, because she understood why they'd left the way they left. You don't report a man like Dorsey when you're a woman like them. A woman with rent due. A woman with no cushion, no lawyer, no powerful friends. You don't report him because you know how it ends. You know whose word gets believed. You know who keeps their job, and it's never you. So you leave, quietly, and the man stays. And the next girl arrives, and it happens again. That was the machine, and Ren was just the newest part to be fed into it. She should have been afraid, and she was. But somewhere underneath the fear, something else was starting to grow. Because for the first time in her life, she wasn't only thinking about surviving. She was thinking about the girls who'd come after her, the ones not yet hired. The ones who'd walk through that door in a year, in 2 years, and get cornered in that same hall, and she thought, somebody has to break this. Somebody has to be the one who doesn't leave quietly. She didn't know yet that it would be her. But the thought had planted itself. And thoughts like that don't unplant. Corbin watched it all. And it tormented him. He read every message Dorsey posted, and his stomach twisted. Because he knew they were lies. He'd seen with his own eyes how decently, how quietly, she'd worked all these months, and he knew the real Dorsey behind the cheerful mask. His guilt wasn't a vague feeling anymore. It was a real weight, pressing on his chest, every time he clocked in, so he started paying attention. Quietly, remembering what Dorsey said, what Dorsey did, even though he didn't know yet what he was keeping it all, for he still didn't have the courage to stand up in public. On her side. He was still afraid of the price, of going against someone with more power than him, but something inside him had changed. Past the point of going back, he couldn't pretend anymore that any of this was a harmless joke for Ren. The day she couldn't take one more second of it came sooner than she expected. It came on an afternoon, when she went down to the wine storage room in the back. To grab a few more bottles for the evening shift, she bent to pick up a crate. And when she turned, Dorsey and Bronwyn were there, blocking the narrow exit, their faces twisted into those familiar mocking smiles. And Dorsey tossed out another casual comment about her late-night visits. To the private room, they expected her to look down and squeeze past them, in silence, like she always did. Except this time. Ren set the crate of wine down, heavy, on the concrete floor, and she stood her ground. Now, you have to understand what that cost her, because for 27 years her whole way of surviving was to disappear. To go small, to go quiet, to let it pass, to be furniture. Because furniture doesn't get hurt, standing up in that storage room was not in her nature. It went against everything she'd built herself to be. Every instinct in her body was screaming. Look down, squeeze past, let it go. Like you let everything go. But she didn't. And for the first time in all those months, she looked Dorsey, directly. In the eye, her voice wasn't a shout. There were no tears in it. But it was so slow, so certain, that the smiles on their faces froze right where they were. She told them she'd known for weeks. About the cruel trap they'd set for her that first Thursday night, that she'd heard every bitter word they'd traded behind her back, and then. She didn't step back, she stepped forward, which forced Dorsey to take a clumsy step backward, into the wooden shelves. Bottles rattling, he opened his mouth, ready to laugh it off, ready to throw out his favorite line. Why are you making such a big deal? We're only joking. But Ren didn't let him finish. She looked straight into his eyes, and she told him. She hadn't come here to argue about whether she'd been hurt. Because a joke aimed at her was something she was used to. Something she could take. Something she could let pass. What she couldn't let pass, what had made her stand here and say these words, was that they'd used a person's inability to hear. As something to amuse themselves, she said they'd called that man the stone-deaf boss, in a mocking tone, as if the fact that he lived in a world with fewer sounds was a flaw worth turning into a joke, without thinking of him as a human being. For even 1 second, she said, if she hadn't happened to know sign language that night. Then the person left sitting there, in the dark, in the discomfort, wouldn't have been her. It would have been him. A man turned, by a group of people hiding behind a door, into the center of a joke he didn't even know was being made. At his expense. And that, she said, wasn't joking, that was cruelty. Dressed up as fun, her voice never rose, but every word landed, clear and heavy, and the storage room, usually humming with the sound of the cooling unit, seemed to fall completely still. She kept going. She told them she had a younger brother, who also lived in a world with fewer sounds, and that she'd fought her whole life, so that no one would ever be allowed to look at him like a joke, so she understood, better than they ever could, exactly how humiliating it was, how unfair to have someone take your difference and turn it into their entertainment. She looked at Bronwyn, then back at Dorsey, and she said she wasn't asking them to like her. They could go on hating her as much as they wanted, but there was a line, and from now on, they were going to understand it. They had no right, none, to take anyone's dignity, hers, or that man's, or anyone's, and turn it into a toy for their boredom. Bronwyn, who always had something sharp to say, couldn't say a word. Her face went pale, and she turned away, like she was trying to avoid Ren's eyes. And Dorsey, the mocking smile that always lived on his lips, was gone completely. He opened his mouth, like he wanted to salvage something, anything, but then he stopped because for the first time, someone had said it to his face, the bare, plain truth of what he'd done. And he realized all his familiar excuses had gone hollow against what she'd just said. And that was when Ren noticed him, Corbin, standing tucked near the entrance to the storage room. He'd witnessed everything, and when her eyes passed over him, he dropped his head fast, both ears burning red, with shame, not because she'd said anything to him, but because every word she'd just spoken had exposed the cowardly part inside him too. Ren said nothing more. She bent down, picked up the crate of wine, and walked out of the storage room, leaving behind a heavy silence, in which, for the first time, nobody was laughing, because there's nothing in this world quite so startling as a quiet person who has finally decided to speak. Now, if this were a simpler story, that would have been the end of Dorsey. But small men who get humiliated don't quietly disappear. They look for a way to feel big again. Dorsey stayed silent for a few days after the storage room. But it wasn't remorse. It was the pressure building up inside a man who'd just been shamed and was hunting for a way to reclaim the pride he thought he'd lost. And the way men like Dorsey usually patch up a wounded ego is by bragging. He started whispering to a few people inside the restaurant and to some acquaintances outside it that he was not someone to be taken lightly, that he had connections, close ones, with Calloway's people, that the powerful guest who came in every week actually respected him. He embroidered the lies to make himself look bigger in other men's eyes, without ever realizing that in the world he was borrowing from, pretending to have a relationship that didn't exist, was not a joke. His boasting traveled, mouth to mouth, out the door, across the city, until eventually, it reached the ear of a man named Fletcher, Ambrose Calloway's right hand, the man whose job was to keep an eye on anything, that might touch the safety or the reputation of the organization. And to a man like Fletcher, a stranger going around town claiming friendship with their people was not something you ignored, not because it was insulting, because it was dangerous. Because once a name like that gets borrowed by outsiders to impress people, it can drag the whole organization into trouble it never wanted to touch. So, one evening, when the shift was nearly over, two well-dressed men walked into the restaurant, calm, polite, so unremarkable that nobody noticed them until they were walking straight toward Dorsey and courteously asked him to step outside. For a few words, Ren was cleaning near the entrance, so she happened to see the whole thing, and she saw the exact moment Dorsey's face changed. When he recognized who those men were, they didn't raise their voices. They made no threatening gesture, nothing you could point to. One of them just stood very close to Dorsey and spoke to him in a low, even voice that Ren couldn't quite hear, but she could see the effect landing on Dorsey's face. Bit by bit, his usual arrogance drained away, replaced by the pallor of a man who just understood that he'd been playing with something whose true weight he'd never once understood. The man reminded him of just one thing, that there are names that shouldn't be borrowed. for little acts of showing off. That this time, they'd come only to make it clear and keep it polite, and that they trusted. There'd be no need for a second time. Then, as quietly as they'd arrived, they nodded, turned, and left, leaving Dorsey rooted to the spot. Bloodless, hands trembling, just slightly. The whole thing lasted only a few minutes. Not one loud sound, not one rough movement. And yet, it left a chill in the air, more frightening than any screaming fight. And Ren, watching from a hidden corner, stood frozen, the cleaning cloth still in her hand, because this was the first times. The very first time. She'd seen with her own eyes. The real world. Standing behind the man she sat with every Thursday night, in that quiet private room, she realized the calm, the kindness, the dry humor, everything she'd seen in him, in that room, was only one side of him. The other side was a power that could make an arrogant man like Dorsey tremble. With nothing but a few soft words, Ren didn't sleep much that week. But it wasn't only fear keeping her up. It was a question, a big, uncomfortable one. Who was Ambrose Calloway? Because she'd thought she knew, the gentleman in the private room. That was the Ambrose she'd built in her mind. Over all those Thursdays, but the men in the suits, the way Dorsey went white, the invisible weight of a name. That was a different Ambrose, one she'd never met. One who lived in a world she couldn't see. And the terrible thing was, they were both real. That's what she couldn't get past. It would have been easier if one were a lie. But no, the same person could sit across from her and sign about the sound of cold soup. And also, with a word, make a grown man tremble. People aren't simple. Ren knew that, but she'd never sat this close to how not simple a person could be. But she noticed something in all her turning it over. Something small and important. The powerful Ambrose had never once been turned on her. Every hard thing she'd seen in him, every flash of that cold, weighty power, it had always been pointed away from her, toward the people who'd hurt her. Never at her. Not once. That didn't erase the fear. Fear like that doesn't erase, but it planted a different seed next to the fear, the seed of a thought that maybe, just maybe, a person could hold great power and still choose, every single day, where to point it, and that the choosing was the whole thing. And that night, Ren couldn't sleep. She got back to the apartment. Late, opened the door quiet, like always, so she wouldn't wake Silas. But instead of collapsing into bed, she sat down on the edge of the bed, in the dark, both hands wrapped around a cup of tea. She'd made it earlier and forgotten to drink it until it went cold. The image from the restaurant kept coming back, again and again, and it wouldn't let her go. Not the image of a fight or anything truly terrible. It was the quietness of it. That was what's made her shiver, the way two unfamiliar men only had to stand close and say a few words, for a loud, arrogant man like Dorsey to go pale and shake, that invisible weight now spread over her thoughts, like a fear she couldn't name, but could feel clearly in every heartbeat, going faster than it should. She thought of Ambrose, of the warm Thursday nights in the private room, of his rare smile, and the way he listened to her, with his whole gaze. And then she thought of the scene she'd just watched, and, for the first time, those two images crashed into each other. Inside her, the gentleman in the private room, and the cold world standing behind him, turned out to be the same person. But what chilled her, more than anything, wasn't fear for herself. It was Silas. The thought of her brother hit so suddenly that her chest went tight, and she looked toward the small room where he was sleeping, her 22-year-old brother, the one she'd spent her whole youth protecting, the one who lived in a world with fewer sounds, and who, therefore, in her eyes, always needed to be protected. Just a little more, she wondered, if she let herself slip deeper into Ambrose's orbit, into that world, with its hidden rules. Might it, one day, reach Silas too? She wondered if she was unknowingly pulling her innocent brother closer to a danger he knew nothing about. The thought alone that something could threaten him because of her choices was enough to make her feel sick. Because if there was one thing this life of so many losses had taught Ren, it was this. She could lose anything. Money, trust, peace. But she must never, never lose Silas. He was the last thing left, the reason she woke each morning and pushed through 2 endless shifts. The only person in the world still waiting for her with a scrap of paper beside the rice pot. So she sat there a long time, listening to the most primitive instinct inside her, screaming at her to step back, to build her wall even higher, before it was too late. Meanwhile, she had no idea that while she sat awake with her fear, something was unfolding on the other side of the city, because Ambrose Calloway, from the very moment he'd started paying attention to the server, with hands that knew how to speak, had ordered Fletcher to find something out. Quietly. Why had someone like her been pushed into his room? On that very first night, he was a man who never believed in coincidence, and his instinct proved right. It didn't take long. Fletcher pieced the whole thing together and brought his boss the unvarnished truth that Ren's first appearance in the private room had been a trap, orchestrated, designed by Dorsey and his crew to humiliate her for amusement, and Fletcher also repeated the filthy rumors Dorsey had spread afterward to disgrace her. And when Ambrose finished hearing it all, his face showed nothing, but a dangerous stillness settled over him, because he understood. The woman he valued, the only person in years who had spoken to him like he was a human being, had been dragged into his life through a joke aimed at the very weakness he hid most carefully. And all this time, she'd been quietly enduring those poisonous rumors, without one word of complaint, to him. The next Thursday, when Ren stepped into the private room, her heart still tangled from that sleepless night. She sensed it immediately. Something was different about him. He didn't smile the way he had in recent weeks. He looked at her a long, long while, then he lifted his hands, and what he signed made her go completely still. He told her he knew everything. He knew about the trap that first night. He knew about Dorsey. He knew about the rumors the man had spread to humiliate her. He said he knew. She'd been carrying all of it, alone, this entire time. And then, with a calm, more frightening than any anger, he signed that she didn't have to endure another day of it. That all she had to do was nod, and he would make Dorsey disappear from her life. He would make sure the man never dared open his mouth to say another word about her ever again. He didn't explain how. He didn't need to. The sharp, deliberate motion of his hands carried a quiet authority that needed no translation, making her fully realize that his world ran on absolute consequences, not idle threats. Ren froze. Let me sit you down in that moment, because it's the hinge the whole story turns on, and I don't want you to rush past it. A woman who has been ground down for months, mocked, cornered, lied about, made into a joke, and then made into a scandal, standing in a room, across from the one person with the power to make it all stop. All she has to do is nod, one nod. And the man who cornered her in the wine cellar, who made her skin crawl in the narrow halls, who dragged her name through the mud, that man simply goes away. You've wanted that, haven't you? At some point. All of us have that moment when someone has hurt us badly and gotten away clean, and we lie awake and we imagine. What if there were justice? Ren had that, right there, being offered to her, free. And for one heartbeat, I won't lie to you, she wanted it. For one heartbeat, the tired, wronged, cornered part of her rose up and said yes. Say yes. You've earned it. Who'd even miss him? One heartbeat. And then something else in her spoke up, quieter. But it didn't go away. It said, and then what? Then what, Ren? Then you're a person who did that? Then you're standing over here, on the side of the machine, the one that grinds people down, the one you were going to break. Then how do you look at Silas? Then, what was the point of any of it? One heartbeat of yes, and a long, cold clarity of no. That's how close it was. That's how human she was. She wasn't a saint. Saints are easy. Saints don't feel the pull. Ren felt the pull, all of it, and she wasn't ready to answer. She looked at Ambrose, into the eyes, waiting for her answer, and she realized this wasn't only a choice about Dorsey. It was a choice about herself, about how far she would let her pain lead her. She opened her mouth, meaning to say something, and found she wasn't ready, so she only signed that she needed a little time, and then she left the room carrying a burden even heavier than the one she'd brought in. 4 days. For 4 days, Ren didn't send Ambrose a single message, not to punish him, not to avoid him, but because she truly didn't know what to say. When her mind was still a tangled mess of questions with no answers, she went to work, came home, cooked dinner, sat with Silas, and did all those ordinary things like a machine, while her thoughts never stopped, circling around his offer. At first, she told herself the safest thing was to step back, to quietly put distance between herself and Ambrose, to let everything cool down. She'd be the invisible server again. The rumors would fade, and most important of all, Silas would be safe. Far from that world of hidden rules she'd only glimpsed, that reasoning sounded sensible. Wise, even. It soothed the frightened part of her, but every single time she almost convinced herself, something inside her caught and wouldn't let her rest. On the 3rd night of the 4, something happened, because brothers know things, especially a brother who spent his whole life reading his sister's face, because he couldn't read her voice. Silas had learned to hear with his eyes, and that night he set down his technical drawings. And he looked at her across the table, and he signed. Something wrong. Not a question, a fact. Ren shook her head, signed, "I'm just tired." And Silas gave her a look. The look a younger brother should not be old enough to give. The look that said, "I've known you my whole life." Don't, she almost told him. The whole thing. The trap. The rumors. The man who'd offered to erase her tormentor with a single nod. But she stopped, because she looked at her brother, her 22-year-old brother, with his trade school drawings, and his whole life ahead of him. And she thought, if I tell him, he'll worry. And if he worries, he'll want to protect me. And that is my job, not his. So she signed something else instead. "Can I ask you something?" He nodded. "If someone hurt you, and I had the power to hurt them back, worse, would you want me to?" Silas frowned, thought about it, the way he thought about everything, carefully. Then he signed, "Would it fix it?" And Ren went still, because that was the whole question. Wasn't it? Would it fix it? She signed, "No, it wouldn't fix it. It would just hurt them." And Silas shrugged. Simple. The way only the young can be simple. About the hard things. He signed. Then, what's the point? And that was it. The whole moral philosophy of the situation. Delivered by a 22-year-old who couldn't hear. Over a plate of cold rice. Then what's the point? Ren laughed. A little. And her eyes stung. Because her little brother, the one she'd spent her whole life protecting, had just, without knowing it, handed her the answers she'd been searching for. That night, after Silas went to sleep, Ren sat with what he'd said, because that was the whole thing, wasn't it? Revenge doesn't fix, it just adds. You take your pain and you make more pain. And now there's just more pain in the world. And you're the one who put it there. She thought about her father. She didn't think about him often. It hurt too much, and it helped too little. But that night she did. She thought about a man who'd been dealt a bad hand, a sick wife, a deaf son, no money, and who'd looked at all that pain. And instead of carrying it, he'd added to it. He'd poured it into a bottle and then walked out the door and never came back. He'd chosen the easy thing. The thing that felt like relief in the moment. And it had cost his children everything, and Ren had promised herself, at 12 years old, standing in a doorway watching him leave. She would never be that. She would never look at her pain and choose to make more. She'd forgotten that promise, buried under years of just surviving. But Silas, without knowing it, had dug it back up, handed it to her across a plate of cold rice. That's the thing about the people we try to protect. Sometimes, without knowing it, they're the ones protecting us. The next evening, alone by the window. After Silas had gone to sleep, she finally touched the deeper thing troubling her and found a name for it. She realized that if she quietly withdrew from Ambrose's life, out of fear, without a single word of explanation, then she'd be doing to him the exact thing she hated most. In Dorsey and the others, she'd be deciding, for him, cutting him out, of a choice he had every right to be part of, because Dorsey and those people, they'd turned him into a pawn in their little joke, without ever asking him a single question, arranging everything about him behind his back, as if he had no right to speak for himself. And now, if she vanished, in silence, just to ease her own fear, then she'd be treating him like a problem to remove, instead of a human being, with the right to choose. And that realization filled her with shame, because for weeks now, she'd taken quiet pride in believing she was different from the people who'd hurt him, and here she was, about to do the very thing that would take his personhood away. She placed her hand on her phone, and, for the first time in 4 days, she sent Ambrose a short message that she needed to see him, that there was something she had to tell him, not in written words, but directly, with her own hands, in the room where everything had begun. He replied, almost immediately. So the next night, Ren stepped into that private room again. But this time, she didn't carry a serving tray. She came, as herself, with something she'd spent 4 days learning how to name. He was already sitting there, waiting. And when she closed the door and sat down across from him, he looked at her with a quiet attentiveness, like he understood that what she was about to say would matter. Ren drew in a deep breath and lifted her hands. She began by thanking him. She signed that she knew his offer had come from a place of wanting to protect her, that in her whole life, full of losses, no one had ever been willing to stand up for her like that, and precisely because of that, she had to be honest. Then she looked straight into his eyes, and she refused. She signed that she didn't want him to retaliate against Dorsey. It wasn't about forgiveness, she signed. It was about the truth of who they were to each other. She signed that on the night she was pushed into his room, they'd both been treated as objects for someone else's cruel amusement, and if she accepted his offer now to crush Dorsey, then she'd be doing the exact same thing, turning his existence into a weapon for her own revenge. She signed slow, making sure he caught every movement. You are not a tool for my anger, Ambrose. You are a man, and I will not treat you as anything less. When she finished that sentence, she saw something shift, faintly, in his eyes, but she didn't stop. She signed about the night she hadn't slept. After she'd seen his 2 men come to speak with Dorsey, she didn't hide her fear from him. She admitted that it had frightened her, that for the first time, she'd truly seen the world standing behind him, a world with hidden rules she didn't understand at all. She told him about Silas, about her fear, that if she stepped deeper into his orbit, one day, that world might reach the younger brother she'd spent her whole youth protecting. She signed that there'd been a moment when she'd meant to quietly step back, to disappear, without explanation, but then she'd realized that doing so would be its own kind of cruelty, a way of deciding for him, of taking away his right to speak, just like the people who'd hurt him. And that was something she would not do. So instead of vanishing in silence, she'd chosen to come here and tell him every truth in her heart, both her feelings and her fears, and then give back to him the right he should have had all along, the right to know who she was, what she feared, what she wanted, and after knowing all of it, to choose whether he wanted to step into the life of a poor server, with a younger brother who needed protecting and a heart used to building walls, and she, too, would choose whether she was brave enough to step into his orbit. But whatever the answer was, it had to come from the truth, not from avoidance. She lowered her hands, and she felt a strange relief. The relief of someone who, for the first time in a very long while, had dared to place her whole true self, both the strong parts and the fragile ones. Before another person, without hiding anything, the private room sank into silence. A silence unlike any they'd shared before, thick and trembling. Because, now, every card was face up. On the table, Ambrose sat in silence. A very long time, so long, that she began to worry. She'd said too much. But when he finally lifted his hands, what he signed made her the one who went still. He said that his whole life, ever since the day he lost his father, no one had ever come to him without bringing one of two things, fear or greed. People came because they feared him, or because they knew he had money and power and wanted to trade for something. He'd lived too long among people who saw him only as a force to use or a danger to avoid, so long that he'd almost forgotten he was also a human being who could be treated. Another way, he signed that when he'd offered to handle Dorsey, part of him had thought that was what she wanted, because it was the only language his world knew how to speak. Someone hurts you, and you make them disappear, but she had just done something no one had ever done. She had refused his power, not because she didn't need it, but because she wanted to protect his dignity. She had seen in him a person worthy of respect, not a weapon to be used. He signed that in the moment she told him he wasn't her knife, she had given him something that neither power nor money in his world had ever been able to buy for him. The feeling of being seen as a whole human being. He paused a while, then he signed that he would not touch Dorsey, not because Dorsey deserved to be spared, but because she deserved to have someone beside her who did not turn every wound into blood and fear. He signed that if being near her meant he had to learn a different way of living than the one he'd known, then he was willing to do it. And in that moment, Ren saw. In the eyes everyone whispered were cold as ice, a warmth completely unhidden. And you know what? Justice for Dorsey, as it turned out, did not come from the underworld she'd feared. It came from the last place she'd expected. Because during those very days, Corbin, the young waiter, finally found the courage he'd been missing for so long. I want to stop for a second on Corbin, because it would be easy to skip him. He's not the hero. He's not the love story. He's the young man who stood behind the door that first night and laughed. But I think he might be the most important person in this whole story. And here's why. Ren's courage that was rare, but it was hers. It came from a lifetime of a particular kind of strength, from raising a brother alone. Corbin didn't have any of that. Corbin was just an ordinary young man, weak, scared, easily led. The kind of person who goes along with the crowd because going along is safe and standing out is dangerous. Most of us, if we're honest, have been Corbin. At some point, in some room, watching something wrong happen and saying nothing. Because saying something costs too much. And that's exactly why Corbin matters. Because he changed. Not because he was brave to begin with. He wasn't. He changed because he couldn't live with himself anymore. Because the small, decent voice inside him, the one most of us learn to ignore, got loud enough that ignoring it hurt worse than acting on it. He realized that his silence all this time had been its own kind of complicity, and that if he kept lowering his head, he'd be, forever, the cowardly version of himself he despised. So he did something quietly and carefully. He gathered everything he knew. The slanderous messages Dorsey had posted in the group chat. Screenshots. All of them. The times he'd seen Dorsey harass others. The things he knew about the girls who'd quietly quit before Ren because they couldn't endure him anymore. And then he brought it to the restaurant's senior management through the proper channels, without hiding his own part. In the original joke, he accepted that he might be implicated too. As long as the truth came to light, he was terrified when he gathered that evidence. His hands probably shook. He knew he might lose his job. He knew the others would turn on him. He knew he'd have to admit his own part in the ugliness. And he did it anyway, not because it was safe, because it was right. And this time, faced with concrete evidence, and the testimony of a witness who dared to step forward. The management could not ignore it. The way they'd ignored scattered complaints in the past, an internal investigation opened. And Dorsey's behavior, which he'd hidden for so long, beneath the disguise of joking, was finally dragged into the light for exactly what it was. When Ren heard from Corbin, during a shift, that he was the one who'd reported everything, she looked at him a long time. And she gave a small nod, not the nod of easy forgiveness, but the nod of recognition that a young man had chosen to do the right thing, late, rather than never. And in that moment, she understood something. That real justice, the kind that lets people lift their heads, never comes from fear or crushing power. It comes from the courage of ordinary, frightened people who decide, one day, that they're done being quiet. Dorsey was dismissed through the proper process, not with any loud, dramatic scene, simply as the inevitable consequence of what he himself had done. He left far more quietly than he'd ever boasted while he was there, with no one left for him to intimidate, no name left for him to borrow and use for bragging. And when he walked out of the restaurant door for the last time, Ren felt no triumph and no pity, only a calm relief, the relief of someone who just had a burden lifted. After carrying it far too long, Bronwyn went completely quiet, not because she'd suddenly become kind, but because the support for her cruelty was no longer there. She kept her distance, and Ren needed nothing more than that. Corbin was the one who changed the most. He didn't become a hero. Some coworkers even looked at him with cold disapproval, because he dared to break the group's unspoken rule of silence. But he came to work standing a little straighter, and he began treating Ren with a sincere respect. Sometimes he'd even, hesitantly, ask her a few questions about sign language, as if trying in his clumsy ways to understand the world he'd once so carelessly turned into a joke. Ren didn't rush to embrace him, but she wasn't cold to him either, because she understood. A young person who knows how to admit he was wrong and tries to change deserves a chance. As for Ambrose, the thing between them didn't suddenly become a radiant love story, full of promises. It grew slowly, carefully, exactly the way two people used to building walls around themselves would find their way toward each other. And there was one thing he did that Ren would remember for a long time. He knew about Silas, about the money she'd once saved for him, before being cheated out of it years ago. And although with his power and his money, he could have erased every financial burden on her shoulders with a single phone call, he did not do that because he understood that doing so would only turn her into someone indebted to him, instead of someone standing beside him as an equal, and that those old hospital bills were a burden she wanted to finish paying. In her own way, with her own sweat, and her own dignity, instead. The only thing he did was open a door. He knew of a free sign language program for young people, at a center he was familiar with, a place where Silas could study more, meet others in similar circumstances, and find a community of his own. He didn't pay anyone. He didn't use influence to force anything. He only gave her the information about that door, and then let her and Silas decide whether to step through it or not. And Ren understood. This was real respect. Not the dazzling kind of rescue that turns another person into someone who owes gratitude, but the act of placing a choice in their hands and trusting they were strong enough to walk forward on their own. She went with Silas the first time, to the door, and no further, because she understood. This was his, not hers. And she stood outside, on the cold sidewalk, and watched through the glass. As her brother walked into a room full of hands, moving, talking, laughing, without a single sound, a room full of people like him, she saw him hesitate at the threshold, the way she'd once hesitated on the edge of that chair. And then she saw a young man inside raise his hands and sign a greeting. And she saw her brother's shoulders come down from around his ears, where they'd lived his whole life. She saw him sign back, and she saw him smile. That smile. the one she'd fought her whole life to protect. And Ren stood there, on the sidewalk, in the cold, and she cried. Not from sadness, but because, for the first time in as long as she could remember, she was wishing her step into a world where he didn't have to be the only quiet one, where he belonged, and she hadn't had to trade her dignity to give it to him. An hour later, he came out, and he was talking with his hands, fast, excited, to a couple of the other students, laughing at something she couldn't see. He wasn't the only quiet one anymore. He was just a guy, laughing with his friends. On a sidewalk, on a cold night, he came over, and he signed, "Why are you crying?" And Ren wiped her face, and signed, "I'm not." And Silas grinned, and signed, "You're a terrible liar. You always were." And they walked home together, through the cold, talking with their hands the whole way. There was one more Thursday I want to tell you about. After the truth came out, after Dorsey was gone, after the walls between them had come down. They were sitting in the private room, and it was raining outside. You could see it on the window, but you couldn't hear it. For him, it never rained with sound, and Ren was watching the rain on the glass, and Ambrose was watching her, and after a while he lifted his hands and asked her something he'd never asked anyone. "What does it sound like?" "The rain." "I don't remember anymore. 15 years, it's gone." And Ren understood that he was asking her for something very small and very enormous to give him back a sound he'd lost. So she thought about it, seriously, the way it deserved, and then she signed. It's soft, like 1,000 tiny hands tapping on the glass. Gentle, but so many that together they make a kind of hush, like the world telling itself to be calm. Ambrose watched her hands, and when it's heavy, she signed. It's like applause from very far away, like a whole crowd somewhere you can't see, clapping, just for you. He was very still, but mostly, she signed. It just sounds like being inside. When you're warm and someone you love is nearby, and you don't have to go anywhere, it sounds like that. And Ambrose looked at the window for a long time. And then he looked back at her. And he signed something she would carry for the rest of her life. "I haven't heard the rain in 15 years, but I think I just did." And outside, the rain kept falling on the glass, without a sound. And inside that small room, two people sat in a silence so full, so warm, so complete, that neither of them would have traded it for every sound in the world. The months passed. And Ren also came to see that Ambrose was changing. He began to speak of different plans, of slowly shifting toward transparent businesses, of carefully untangling himself from old obligations. One step at a time. He didn't promise to become a different man overnight, because they both understood life doesn't work that way. But the direction he was moving in was enough for Ren to see that the man who had once lived alone in the middle of all his power was quietly searching for a path toward the light. And that perhaps, only perhaps, she and Silas would become part of the future he was beginning to dare to dream about. And so, on a Thursday night like so many before it, Ren stepped into the private room at the end of the hall. But this time, everything was so different from that first evening that sometimes she wondered whether the woman walking in today was even the same girl who'd once been pushed into this room as a joke. She no longer carried a serving tray. She came as someone who was expected. And Ambrose was already sitting there, lifting his eyes to look at her. With a gaze the whole city had once whispered was cold as ice, but that to her had become the warmest place of all. She sat down across from him, and in that quiet moment her eyes drifted toward the narrow crack in the door. The little opening where months before, three faces had once pressed close to wait for her to fall apart. The crack that had once served as a stage for cruelty, disguised as a joke. Now it was only an ordinary crack in a door. No one stood there anymore. No eyes lurked in secret. No mocking laughter echoed back. It had returned to its humble, true nature. A quiet line bordering the private space of two people. And Ren realized the greatest change was not in the room itself. It was in what had happened inside it. Ambrose saw her looking toward the crack in the door, and he understood what she was thinking. He lifted his hands and signed a short sentence. He said he had once thought this room was the safest place he had, because it was private, and no one could reach him there. But now he knew. It had only truly become a place. Since she walked into it, that simple sentence made Ren laugh. A light and complete smile. The smile of someone who had finally found a place where she did not have to build walls. They sat there, speaking with their hands, in the absolute stillness of the room. Not a single sound passing between them, and yet Ren had never felt more deeply heard. Outside, the city was still loud with car horns and hurried footsteps. Outside, there was still an entire world from which Ambrose was carefully, step by step, trying to untangle himself, so he could move toward a brighter life. But inside this small room, between two people who had long been used to hiding behind walls, there was only silence. And it was the most beautiful silence she had ever known. Not the silence of loneliness, or of things left unsaid, but the silence of two people who understood each other so deeply that sound was no longer necessary, because that cruel joke, once created to make Ren the center of ridicule, had turned into something none of the people who set it up could ever have imagined. By accident, they had led two of the loneliest people in that whole city to find each other. And the story of Ren and Ambrose, which had begun with a scheme meant to degrade human dignity, ultimately became proof of the very opposite. That dignity, once protected, has the power to change even the things that seem impossible. That a person's dignity must never be turned into someone else's joke. That true listening does not belong to the ears, but to attention and to compassion. That sometimes the people who seem the most different, a poor waitress and a powerful man, one betrayed by her trust and one lonely inside his own strength, can heal each other, simply by seeing one another as whole human beings. And that the greatest strength a person can ever possess does not lie in the power to crush others, but in the kindness to lift them up. Ren almost missed it. She almost kept her head down that first Thursday and let it pass, like she'd let everything pass her whole life. But she raised her hands, and two of the loneliest people in that whole city finally got to be seen.